So I want to start with talking about the partition plan. I was asked to talk about the legal stuff. It's completely irrelevant. It is because even, as we look at possible ICC prosecution for the last massacre in Gaza, I mean, it's a state-centric system. It will take at least 2 decades to finish an investigation, by which time God knows how many other massacres would have happened. It's a state-centric system that we are asked to rely upon to enforce the rights of a stateless people. And so it will always fail the Palestinian people, and it will always fail the oppressed people, right? So I'm not going to talk about that. I do want to pick up a little bit where we left off. Now, shortly after, I don't remember exactly what was the last clip, but right now, well, let's go. 1973, 1978, I forget which, Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, walked into Jerusalem at the invitation, occupied Jerusalem at the invitation and with the permission of the Israeli occupying forces. And it was at that point that U.S.-Israeli hegemony was cemented in the region. And that was very critical. And it was also at that point that the Palestinian struggle was abandoned by all Arab regimes. Not Arab peoples, but by all Arab regimes. And so it was at that point that the Palestinians were really left to fend for themselves, not just against Israelis, but against the U.S.-Israeli imperial project in the Arab world. Fast forward, the Palestinian Authority is formed, Oslo in 1994. 6 years after the signing of the Oslo quote-unquote peace accords, you have you can call it the 13th or the 15th Intifada of 2000, September 29th, 2000 was launched. And that was in response to the failure of the Oslo Accords, which was dubbed as the Land for Peace Agreement, right? And the idea was, we'll let you have your land, Palestinians, and you stop fighting us. Well, that of course never happened. They continued to expand. Palestinians naturally resisted, as you would if somebody was coming into your home or taking your garden or what have you. And so was launched the Intifada of 2000. In 2005, I don't know if many people, 2005, some agreement was brokered, and it wasn't really an agreement by any real meaning of the word, but some agreement was brokered between the PA and the Zionist entity government to have the settlers pulled out of the Gaza Strip. And there were several reasons for that. The primary reason was that it was no longer really feasible financially feasible and even militarily feasible to control the Gaza Strip with the settlers being present on the land. It was becoming more difficult. And so they withdrew the settlers. And almost immediately after withdrawing the settlers from the Gaza Strip, they began bombing campaigns. Not only in Gaza, not only did they do that, but then they unleashed settlers throughout the West Bank to attack and kill Palestinians in the West Bank, right? And that was the beginning. And right up until that period, the settlers, this idea that there are these extremists who want to expand into the West Bank and all these areas, they were kind of shunned in the more secular Israeli society. What's happened since then is they've been brought into the fold of mainstream Israeli society and governance. And the most extremist elements of those settlers, of the ultra-religious right, are the ones who are running the government and have now mainstreamed, right? And so what has happened since 2005 is we've seen a further shift to the right. I mean, right is an understatement. And so the whole of Israeli society and Israeli policy now is of the same mindset. And that's what we're seeing now. So I'd like to talk about what's been happening since October. And it's very important that we understand that just as we saw from 1936 to 1947 and 1948, mind you, I'd like to say it was left out, but the few Palestinians that were spared in the 1948 territories that you know as Israel, right, the borderless state that's still borderless, right, there were labor camps, and a lot of Palestinians were actually enslaved for a long time. And the ones who weren't put into direct enslavement were indirectly enslaved. So they didn't have lands. They were forced to work for the Israelis who stole their lands, and then whatever they got paid, the father, let's say, got paid, the children were actually enslaved by the Israeli boss. Right? The children would be pulled out of school, tied, and forced to work the land that they once owned, right? And this happened, and I'm not talking about past history. I'm talking about until the 80s, 90s, and to a large extent still happens today. So October, the beginning of our, so what we're seeing now and what we've seen since the 1930s, 1940s is, flows, right? There are periods where there's an escalation of the very policies that Chaim Weizmann and Ben-Gurion were talking about, right? Which is exile by terror, right? You kill a lot of people, or exile by compulsion. They have no jobs and you make them leave, right? Constantly escalate, waves and wanes, right, depending on the period. And what we're seeing now is another escalation. And it's a more measured escalation by my estimation. And it's more measured, I think, in large response and with an eye to the international response to the level of violence that they're allowed to inflict, right, before there's a mass, a fuming response as we had with Gaza. And that's very important for us to keep in mind, that there is a relationship between how much violence they exact, or how concentrated that violence is, and the international mass people's response. What's interesting about this round is, again, that it largely echoes what we saw in Deir Yassin, the targeting of children, Palestinian children specifically, school-aged children, and the targeting of girls and women. This we have not seen to this degree in a long time, at least on a one-by-one basis. And it's done with an absolute theater of casualness, right? I mean, there is a display of quotidien to normalize that sort of, this is the Palestinian body, not just to normalize it for the Palestinians, for whom this could never be normal, right? But really to normalize it outside of Palestine, to the region, particularly those who are trying to rise up against still, perhaps around two, against the counter-revolutions, and of course to the outside world. The West, not just the settlements, but the wall, this wall that the ICJ deemed was illegal, right, is only 30% complete. This is what we're seeing since 1994, post-Oslo. 30% complete, which means that it continues, right, to grow based on how many Palestinians they can kick out, kill, how much more land they can take, and then wrap around. So you have, the wall is only 30% complete, still being built. Palestinians, I think, in the West Bank have 40% unemployment rates. The ones who are able to get work in the 48 territories or in settlements are paid, I think it's about a quarter of what Israelis are paid, are often robbed of that payment when they are paid, and are not allowed access to trade unions. The settlements are expanding. Area C, a result of the Oslo Accords, takes up about 60% of the Palestinian West Bank, that tiny little strip, right? Right now, 42% of that 60% is completely gone. So this generation that's rising up now was born under Oslo, and they've seen nothing of Oslo but more humiliation, more checkpoints, more disenfranchisement, and more murder, right? Waves and wanes. The refugees, 2/3 of the Palestinian population are refugees. Despite all you're seeing about the Syrian refugees and all of this, Palestinians remain the largest refugee population in the world to this day. And the refugee camps were designed, by design, they were made to limit the growth of Palestinians. Despite that, the Palestinians have grown, and that's very important, and it was very important in Kufr Qasim, for example. I think there were only a few hundred people left, and now there's upward of 50,000, which is fantastic, in the 48 territories, right? So the refugees are being attacked throughout the Arab world. The Arab regimes are now not only attacking Palestinians, but are openly, now they've traded before, they've dealt with the Israeli government before, but they're normalizing openly the importance of working with Israel, right? And they're beginning to normalize it. In the Khalij, Saudi Arabia is being public about it, Egypt, of course, being very public about it, and criminalizing Palestinians. The infrastructures of return that were developed, spontaneously really by people who left their towns together and then continued to live together in Syria and Lebanon and in Jordan, are being destroyed. So we are facing a truly grim situation, right? Despite that, the response to the violence, to the continued land confiscations, to the attacks globally, Palestinian youth, right, have taken it upon themselves to resist. And they're doing this in what is a relatively new way, meaning in a way that we haven't seen in 30 or 40 years. It's not being coordinated with any Palestinian political party. In fact, it's acting in opposition to many. In Gaza, we saw Palestinians breaking the concentration camp fence that surrounds the Gaza Strip over the objections and over the agreements that Hamas has, indirectly with the Israeli government to patrol that fence, right? Presumably to protect Palestinians from getting killed by the Israelis, right? No, the Palestinian youth went and they actually physically destroyed it for a period. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has been for a very long time trying to repress Palestinian resistance. And the Palestinian Authority is very scared of the idea of this resistance continuing. Because what they say is they're afraid that Israel is going to enter and more fully reoccupy the areas. Well, I mean, exactly. What difference would that make? And so they're afraid of losing their bargaining power and their position, right? Which has, not to be has some impact because it employs a lot of Palestinians, ultimately meaningless, I think. So the Palestinian Authority is very worried about this resistance continuing. But what this latest round of resistance echoes that predated, the pre-PA, pre-Palestinian Authority resistance, in that it's number one, completely uncoordinating with existing parties that collaborate with the Zionist occupation government, and it itself is leaderless, and it is on the cusp of its own, possibly creating its own new leadership, one that more accurately reflects Palestinian demands. A recent poll, people have always said, oh, the Palestinians want two states, and the Palestinians, want negotiations, and of course they were only referring to Palestinians in the West Bank, right? The 2/3 of the Palestinian population had always wanted a return and had always wanted, whatever. So now even the Palestinians in the West Bank that are polled are saying, no, we understand that the only way that our grievances are going to be addressed is through resistance, and two states is completely unfeasible. I mean, for God's sake, even Zionists are saying that two states are completely unfeasible. And so these youth are responding to this. Number one, the complete and utter failure of Oslo. Number two, the collaboration between the Palestinian elements and the occupying entity. And number three, this new kind of reversion to the ultimate, the earlier resistance movement. Right? So full resistance, right to return, and that's huge. Now, let's keep in mind that peace negotiations and agreements were only mobilized at times where the resistance was winning. And not a single inch of Palestinian land has ever been liberated by any peace agreement. It has always only been liberated by resistance, right? And not just Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanon, nothing has happened through peace agreements. Most important, I think, about this phase in the Palestinian resistance is that what the youth are doing, they're rendering as irrelevant of all of these, tools of occupation and imperialism, is they are kind of reframing the Palestinian movement in an anti-colonial framework. And that's very important. And I think that's not only very important just to Palestine, but it's also very important for the region, especially now. And so we are seeing perhaps another opportunity for Palestinians to be at the forefront of what we hope will be another resurgence of Arab liberation movements across the world. On the issue of peace, I like to tell people it's amazing if you consider what Palestinians endure, just the daily humiliation that Palestinians endure, the degradation at the checkpoints, getting spit at, watching your families embarrassed, the amount of peacefulness that Palestinians have exercised in the past 100 years is absolutely epic. Yes. Any more peacefulness is a mass suicide. Yeah. Anything less than resistance is a suicide. So what do we do here? First of all, as I said, their escalated, another round of Nakba is being measured by our international response to that escalation. And we need to take it more seriously because the realities on the ground are very grim. Secondly, to reiterate what Matt said, every time a distinction is made, and I've had this made to me God, hundreds of times, right? Between the good Palestinian and a bad Palestinian, the peaceful Palestinian and the one who wants violence. What happens is that you criminalize us. You divide us and you criminalize us. And this is how the American government and the Israeli government are able to justify both the murder, the prosecution, and the imprisonment and liquidation of Palestinian movements in the U.S., as we were watching in the Chicago raids in 2010, and now with the prosecution of Rasmi Yaoudi again. So this is what happens when you adopt this narrative of peace and resistance versus nonviolent versus violence. It's a very dangerous narrative to adopt. So adopt that. The right of Palestinian return is critical, right? 2/3 of the Palestinian population has the right to return to their homes. By any measure, you don't need to talk about laws, it's basic common sense. The repatriation of every single Palestinian refugee back to their original homes and lands, logistically, is far easier than bringing our friends from Brooklyn to come squat on our homes in the West Bank. Cheaper, easier. Number 2, would require at best displacement of 10% of the Israeli population. They would still live where they wanted to live, right? And I can't even imagine that displacement happening. Most of this land is held as green spaces and green parks. That has to be at the center of Palestinian movements moving forward. These two are critical if we are to talk about Palestinian equal rights. This is the heart of Palestinian equality. Their right to defend themselves against violence, and violence includes settlements, and their right to return to their homes. And it's not a historic right. This applies to me when I try to go back to my country. BDS is very critical. I think that we need to take responsibility for the Zionists in our communities, and we need to start finding them, identifying them, exposing them, blacklisting them, and stopping them from engaging in criminal acts of violence against Palestinians, and from being part of the new repression movements across the U.S. Now, the Zionist movements are at the thrust of the anti-Muslim movements, and they're also at the thrust of a lot of the repression work. So I think that's what we've got to do.